Welcome to the last session of the Conference on Fear of Art, and thank you all for staying. This has been a long 2 days, but I think a really rich and exciting 2 days. And I think our concluding session will make the conference even more exciting. And I think it's a fitting end to this conference. This is a rather different session. It's more of a panel discussion, although than some of the earlier sessions. Let me also say that all of this conference will be up on the Center for Public Scholarship website. It's all been videoed and will be available not immediately. And also all of the talks from the conference will become an issue of social research, which you can pre-order or order when it comes out. And it will, I think it's at least a year away before I don't remember our schedule well enough to tell you the date of that this issue, Fear of Art, will be published, but it will be published and all the papers will be there for perpetuity as an issue of our journal. So let me let a colleague say a word who has an announcement to make before I introduce the moderator.
Okay. Thanks, Ariane. Hi, I'm Ann Gaines. I'm Dean for the School of Art, Media, and Technology at Parsons. And just a brief interruption to invite the conference organizers, participants, and attendees to a reception after the conclusion of this final panel. We'll be having a reception just down the street at 6:30 in coordination with the College Art Association conference going on, so lots to celebrate. It's in the Sheila Johnson Design Center in 2 West 13th Street, and so we hope you'll bring the critical dialogue down the street to join us there and celebrate. Thank you.
Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Svetlana Mencheva, who is Director of Programs at the National Coalition Against Censorship. She was an academic for many years before she became the Director of Programs at the Center Against Coalition Against Censorship, and it's been a kind of major worker and defender of rights to speak and to freedom of expression and against censorship. She is co-author or editor of Censoring Culture, Contemporary Threats to Free Expression, published by New Press in 2006, and in 2007 she curated an exhibit, Filth, Treason, Blasphemy, Museums and Censorship, at the McCormick Tribune Freedom Museum in Chicago. So you see that from this little bit I've told you, she's had a major career of dealing with issues of censorship and the rights not to be censored. And so it's my pleasure to now give it to Svetlana.
Thank you, Ariane. It's a privilege and it's a challenge to be leading the last panel of what has been such a productive conference in terms of ideas. We've been talking about the power of art to transform, but also the complicity of art, the dangers of art, the emotions it arouses, both in terms of reverence and intense hatred. And we also started talking about censorship kind of all through, but especially in the last session. So we're not going to be tying all these strings together. It's up to you in your future research and writing. But this panel is a way to look at ourselves a little, look at our institutional structures, because artists produce art, but then art comes to the public through institutions. There are mediators, and those mediators are frequently filters. So how do we, where does the institution come in, and how does this fear of art affect the institution? How does the institution fear art? And I'm an activist too and an advocate. So one of my interests is the future. We look at what's the status today, we can critique, but also offer ways to go forward and negotiate our various fears and difficulties and manage to have a really open civil dialogue, which hopefully the best of art leads us towards. Self-censorship is actually a great prism today, after what has happened in France early in the year, to look at the state of artistic freedom. Because we're talking, and I want to go back to the first panel that started this conversation, that started the conference. There's a conversation about limits. And we know limits exist. There are legal limits to what can be said. There are legal limits in every country in the world. In some, there are more than others. The US has very low limits on free speech, but it does have limits. And then, of course, there are the limits set by repressive governments, and there are the limits set by the very kind of neoliberal socioeconomic structure we live in, where we're not all equal to speak. We know that. And the limits of the art world, the limits of the art market. So we're bound by boundaries. We're not by any means absolutely free. But when we talk about self-censorship, how do we define it? So within all these existing limits, how do you talk about this specific issue of self-censorship? And I have to say that in all the years I started an arts advocacy project at the National Coalition Against Censorship. That's how I came there. And everybody says it's really self-censorship is the big issue. It's not so much censorship nowadays, especially in the West. And self-censorship is when you don't do something in your own practice, whether it's your own artistic practice or you're as a curator in your practice as an institution, something that you would want to otherwise do, something that is artistically justified, but you don't do it for some fear or for some sensitivity involved. And just to run through the possible reasons to ground us in what the parameters of self-censorship could be. For instance, there's the fear of donors pulling funds. And art cannot survive without money. So that is a serious and legitimate concern. And we saw the Metropolitan Opera decide to not live broadcast the death of Klinghoffer because some donors objected, and it was legitimately afraid that it will lose funds. Was that the right decision? It was certainly an act of self-censorship. We have increasingly, after Charlie Hebdo, fears of violence. And actually a museum close to Paris, in Clichy, just maybe 2 weeks ago, did not want to have a piece it was about women in Islam. And the townlet received some concern from a Muslim group. And they said, well, there might be violence here. So the artist withdrew her work, and then every other artist in the show pulled their work as well. But fears of violence are very real, and they're not going to go away. There have been threats of violence that have caused the closing of an exhibition at the San Francisco Art Institute a few years back. Previously at the Watts Towers Art Center in LA, an exhibition was closed because of fears of violence. Much more recently in London, the Barbican closed the show because of fears of violence. So that is happening, and it will probably happen more and more. So how do we negotiate that? And Ai Weiwei was mentioning the kind of disturbing fact of government censorship becoming interiorized by an institution when the Ullens Arts Center erased his name from the people involved in the exhibition, even though they had received no direct government pressure, but they already knew we will run into trouble, so we have to erase your name. Of course, there is the concern about offense, and we'll hear about that more. A concern about offending the community, to what extent, and how shall we deal with that concern? So I'd like to introduce, it's an amazing roster of participants that are both with power in the art world, and they're also people that have written about art. So they both have the power of decision-making, institutional decision-making, but they also have looked at it and can analyze what is going on. And the first speaker will go in order of appearance. The first speaker is Jeffrey Deitch, who you probably know as an art dealer in New York. He's been involved in the New York art scene since the 1970s as an art writer, art critic, and dealer. He started Deitch Projects in 1996. A very successful project, which was closed in 2010 as he went to become director of LA MoCA. One of his most recent activities is this very, very big book, which documents the last, I believe, years of Deitch projects called Live the Art. The next speaker is Boris Groys, who is a philosopher, an art critic, media theorist, and expert in late Soviet postmodern art and literature and the Russian avant-garde. He is currently global distinguished professor of Russian and Soviet studies at NYU. Boris Groys was involved in the conceptual art scene in Moscow in the 70s and coined the term Moscow conceptualism. So he defined a movement. He has also curated numerous international art exhibitions, as well as having written many, many books on art and philosophy. One of the books that he became well known in the United States was The Total Art of Stalin. And I love the way that the Boston Globe kind of in a one sentence summarized the book. It said that artists, one of the messages of the book is that artists, for all their insights into the human condition, can make a hash of society as completely as the most cynical of politicians. Sitting next to Boris is Lisa Phillips, who is the director of the New Museum and has been director of the New Museum of Contemporary Art since 1999. And she was there when the new building was built. I was asking Lisa about, does the New Museum have some history of censorship? And she couldn't think of one. And the only connection is that actually it was founded in a way on an act of censorship. When Marcia Tucker came to found the New Museum in 1977, she had been fired from the Whitney because of a very controversial exhibition of Richard Tuttle's work. So since then, the New Museum has been showing precisely the work of artists who wouldn't be shown anywhere else. They showed one of the last pieces I know of. They showed the David Wojnarowicz Fire in My Belly piece, which was censored at the Smithsonian. So their programming has been extremely censorship-free, although some of you might have information about censorship they have perpetrated. Finally, Jack Persekian, you just heard him, but for those of you who came for this panel, he's director and head curator at the Palestinian Museum, which is opening in 2015. And he just spoke at the previous panel about this museum as a kind of network of hubs, which to me is a fascinating idea of a museum, because the museum here is in question, the frame of the museum. He has been a longtime supporter of regional artists and is the founding director as well as of Anna Deal Gallery, and I'm probably mispronouncing, the Al Mamal Foundation for Contemporary Art in Jerusalem, and Zen Productions. The reason I know about Jack was that he hit the news when he was fired by the as head of the Sharjah Biennale because of what, he has a different narrative of that, but what was in the news because of this one work that was in the show that was considered offensive. And it was a work that was in public space. So we'll be also talking about, the museum as a frame and the public space. So without further introductions on my part, I will give it Jeffrey Deitch.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this dialogue. And it's a wonderful honor for me to be on this panel with Boris, Lisa, and Jack. And it brings back a wonderful memory. Jack and I worked together more than 10 years ago on an exhibition of the work of Gada Amer at his art space in Jerusalem. It was an extraordinary experience.
If you want to advance your show, you need to go to the podium.
Oh, okay. All right.
Unless you don't want to show your images.
Yeah, I have some images to show, and we'll get into that in a minute. So I would like to share with you a case study of a confrontation between art with a strong political message and a community with a special sensitivity to the subject. It was a very challenging situation that I faced only 5 months into my directorship at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. Art museums and galleries in this country are generally free zones where provocative political art is accepted and embraced. In my 15 years of projects in my New York gallery, we presented numerous politically potent and transgressive works. And when strident artwork is presented in a public realm, on the other hand, outside the confines of the protected art space, the reception can be very different. This is a story about street art. So, as a lot of you know, I've been engaged with street art and graffiti art since the 1970s. And it has long been one of my missions to present a rigorously curated exhibition of street art that would document its contribution to the history of contemporary art and culture. And Art in the Streets, which I developed for MoCA, was the first major museum exhibition to do this, and my first MoCA project. When organizing Art in the Streets, it was my intention to invite the leading street artists in the world, including Banksy, Os Gemios, Barry McGee, Swoon, and JR, to create special large-scale works for the show. I was especially excited about inviting an extraordinary street artist, Blue, from Bologna, Italy, who had only exhibited in the United States once before on the facade of my gallery in Long Island City. And he had created a remarkable mural of printing presses churning out dollars just again and again without stop. And this astonishing image was visible across the East River from the United Nations headquarters. It was a very prescient comment on the then incipient economic crisis. It was around 2008. So I invited all the artists to come to Los Angeles the beginning of April, to work 2 weeks in advance prior to the mid-April opening. And all the artists enthusiastically accepted, arranged to come to LA. Everyone except Blue, who insisted, I can't come in April. I can only come the first week of December. And I said, well, don't you know that's the week I'm at Art Basel Miami Beach? I can't be there. I want to be there with you. I think he was very well aware of that, but he insisted on coming the only week of the year when I wouldn't be there. So I was so enthusiastic about inviting him. I said, well, let's do it. So arranged, he came to stay in my house, and we arranged everything for him. And while I was away, he began his mural. And you see, this is in progress here. And this is the finished mural. And see what it is, a field of coffins with dollar bill shrouds rather than American flags. So inside a museum, this would be completely tolerated in the dialogue of the art world and myself, most of all of us, sympathize with the message. But this was in a very special context, which I'll get to. So when I came back to Los Angeles, I saw the mural in progress. It was about 3/4 done. And I showed Blue what was going on in the neighborhood. He had no idea. He was actually crestfallen because he didn't realize this. And so we had an arrangement. He would finish the mural over the next few days. We would photograph it. We would include it in the exhibition catalog. And then he would come back. This is where we're painting out the mural. He would come back when the exhibition was coming up and do another one. And he agreed that we would have to paint the mural out. I'm going to show you in a minute why. This is the actual exhibition, Art in the Streets. So this is the context, the neighborhood context. This is the Museum of Contemporary Art, and you see this monument that's in the center that a lot of the visitors to MoCA just walk by. They don't pay any attention to it. But it's a very sacred space for people in the Japanese community. And if you know, MoCA is located in Little Tokyo. And a lot of people in the art world don't know, but Central Avenue, the street on which MoCA is located, was where the buses were parked to bring the entire Japanese American community of Los Angeles, pack them into the buses to take them into the internment camps during the Second World War. So it's a very, very emotionally laden space, and diagonally across the street from MoCA is the former main temple of the Japanese community, which the government turned into the administration center to track everybody with Japanese American ancestry to intern them. And there was this unusual, ironic provision that if young men who were in the internment camps would volunteer for the United States military, they could get out of the camp, serve in the US military, while their mothers, fathers, sisters were actually interned. And a number of these young men were so determined to show their patriotism, to show how much they believed in America, that they were not enemies. They formed some of the fiercest, most decorated fighting units in the history of the US military. And after the war, there was a long attempt to build this monument, the Go for Broke Monument, which honors the many men who lost their lives in the Second World War, fighting while their relatives were in the internment camps. There are still a few veterans left. They're in their 90s now, and it's a very emotional, moving thing to see. As when I was at MoCA, every morning, a number of the veterans go out to the monument and wash it by hand, these people who are in their 90s, and then they spend the afternoon sitting there under an umbrella with a little card table, and visitors come and they talk to them about the history. This is something that the art world is not really fully aware of. And that's one of the gentlemen. And we have an interesting interview with him. Just give some context.
Toki, what does the Go for Broke monument represent for you?
Well, for me, it tells what the veterans did during the war and to help our people. And we've been discriminated many years, and to me, if we can get the story out and people know about it, then maybe some of that discrimination will go away.
And then there's another video where he addresses the mural.
So Toki, back in 2011, we had an exhibition where an artist painted a mural on the wall next to the Go for Broke monument that depicted coffins covered with dollar bills instead of American flags. Can you tell me what your reaction was?
Well, I couldn't understand why they put something like that up there. A coffin, to me, it's kind of a disgusting thing. And then across the street in back of us is the building across the street on Temple in Alameda is the VA, and many people from their windows had seen the same thing, and they were very upset. So after complaining right away, Mocha had it all painted over and erased. But I didn't really understand what the point was for them to put something like that up there. Maybe they just call it art. I don't know. But I'm not that kind of a person, so I didn't really understand what it meant.
Okay, so, well, we call it art. So I've laid out two poles of this. On one side, we have a very strong mural that the consensus of the art world believes that this is the kind of thing that we can use our platform in art to influence public opinion. But here's a community that is very, very sensitive to this subject. And not only this work of art very personally offensive to people in this community, not just the veterans, but their families and the whole community. But there's a whole other issue. Svetlana got into this wider issue of the pressures on the institution to actually present a radical show like this, to present a show of street art in a museum. It's never been done to this extent in an American museum. It's a very delicate situation, and almost certainly, if this had gone on and there'd be lots of public protest from the Japanese community, the exhibition would have been shut down. Most likely, sponsors would have withdrawn, and just been too much pressure. And I think if some of you know that the Brooklyn Museum was supposed to take the show, lost its commitment when Peter Vallone, the president of the New York City Council, threatened that if the Brooklyn Museum went ahead with the street art show, he would do everything he could to make sure that the museum lost all of its city funding. So one walks a tightrope, and you have to be politically savvy to put something together, and that's a tough show like this. But it was very, very painful for me, someone who really got into this whole field, thinking of art as an extension of political activism. So I began when I was a teenager. It was very painful for me to be in this position to actually tell an artist we had to paint out his mural. But I'll leave it at that, and some more discussion can take place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Boris, I'm centering myself right now. I have so much to say about this, but we will do the questions at the end.
Okay, in a certain way, what I want to say is a continuation of Jeffrey's point. So it's more or less obvious that a lot of censorship has to do simply with fear, not with fear of art, but fear of authorities and fear of being persecuted, fear of losing funding, fear of even coming to jail, if it is authoritarian regime you're working in. So these cases, when people simply are afraid to be heard, these are clear cases, and the fronts are also clear. More complicated are the situations in which the artists, curators avoid to hurt the feelings of other people. So not to be hurt, but to hurt the others. That is a complicated situation, like the situation Jeffrey just described. I was asked to structure my presentation around a specific case, and a specific case, I took the case of Pussy Riot, because I think their action is pretty well known in New York, and you can see the video that was made not during the action, but based on this action at the PS1 now, for example. So if you look, it's not about self-censorship from the side by side of Pussy Riot, because they were very audacious in their action, but rather this action provoked a lot of comments and a lot of criticism in Russian media. And not only from the people who were, let's say, against this group, but by a lot of people who actually very much sympathized with their position still. They try time and again to explain why they don't like the action and what they wouldn't do such an action themselves. So they explained their attitude, they explained why they would practice self-censorship, in fact, yeah, instead of going so far as Pussy Riot did. And so it was interesting field of study for me, and I also commented on that also in Russian media several years ago, and discussed that with Pussy Riot group too. So what's interesting about that is that you remember that the central action by them was so-called punk prayer. So the singing a prayer to Virgin Mary to remove Putin from power. And they sang the prayer in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, and specifically in an altar space, which is sacral from the position of Russian Orthodox tradition. And so relatively, I would say almost the majority, half, maybe majority of commentators said, yes, we support that, we support the action, we support the prayer, but we do not support the fact that this prayer took place in the altar, which is a sacral space. I especially was impressed by a comment of one old lady. She gave her name and her age, and she said, you know, when I go into the museums, also Russian museums and museums all everywhere in the world, I see a lot of holy icons that are exhibited there as artworks. I'm a religious person, and I always think it would be a good idea to pray to them. But I never do that, not to offend the feeling of the visitors. So I practice self-censorship in relationship to the feelings of non-believers. So because if I go to them on the territory of enemy, yeah, museum is for her territory of enemy, then I respect my enemy and I look at the icons, I don't pray. And even I don't make a sign of cross. So why they come to me? If they would remain in the museum, it would be not a problem. And that was interesting to me because I thought if there is this kind of specific sacral meaning for the images or text, what actually is that? I think the good example of this kind of understanding is voodoo, because it's a very basic example. Yeah? So if you take an image of somebody and you make a second kind of performance on this image according to certain rules, then the person represented by this image dies. That means you can kill somebody by image. For example, if you are a believer in the ancient Greek religion and magic, if you open the mummy, this mummy kills you. I always, when I went to British Museum in Louvre, I always imagined how an ancient Egyptian priest would feel himself visiting British Museum in Louvre and looking at that mummies. How Inca priest will feel looking at the Inca sacral objects presented in our museum as art objects. In other words, art in itself is blasphemous. So what I want to say is that if there is a magic, if the artwork, if the images have the magic, then the art is anti-magic, it's a negative magic, it's a magic to destroy the magic. So art was always a machine of profanation, profanization, of blasphemy, of secularization, always denying to the art, to the images, the sacral and magic power. It's something that contemporary political artists now suffering. Yeah, the suffering that they're doing political art, nothing happens. Yeah. But it is a result of these long decades of struggle against sacrality. I must remember, I have to remember, yeah, I can avoid that I also participate in this kind of activities in the Soviet Union in the 70s, because all friends of mine, I was writing blasphemic text, and all friends of mine made blasphemic works here, playing not only with sacral images of Orthodox Church, but also with official images of Soviet ideology in blasphemic, irreverent, ironic way. And people were shocked. They were shocked by this blasphemic play much more than they were shocked or would be shocked by some kind of serious, respectful criticism. How far this being shocked can go shows a good example. A couple of days ago, or maybe a week ago, Patriarch Kirill said publicly how he's sad if he looks at the Black Square by Malevich. Yeah? This kind of blaspheming use of an icon, yeah? An icon of nihilism, icon, anti-icon, yeah? Satanic icon. And a writer who is very talented, very much on the right, on the Orthodox right, Prokhanov, he wrote a text, a novel, about how perestroika and destruction of Russia came about. And he describes that in the following way, that in the night, you know, there are cracks in the original Black Square of Malevich. And he said that original Black Square Malevich is actually entrance to the hell, and from the hell to the world. And so in the night, the hell comes to Black Square of Malevich, these cracks widen, and demons come to the Moscow and take power over the Moscow. So you see here a magic relationship to the image. How you can do art without offending that? It's precisely the same problem as with Charlie Hebdo, for example. These images were not critical, were not directed against the religion or against certain position, political position. They were images that were programmatically secular, and they are images that have shown that images are only images. But the question is, and that is maybe last remark, how far this secularization really went. I mean, not only Orthodox context, I mean, not only Islamic context, but for example, partially the same people who supported Pussy Riot require the removal of the mausoleum of Lenin for Red Place because they say the image of Lenin makes them feel bad. Yeah? So the feeling are hurted by the image, and we also saw the huge wave of iconoclastic destruction of the monuments of communism in East Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So our relationship to the images, also if we are inside art, yeah, is always ambiguous. And this kind of complicated relationship, half secularized and half magic, half negative, half positive magic, is what brings us time and again into conflict. And the conflict that is very difficult to navigate, yeah, because the feelings that are hurt are real. We have also this feeling in different occasions or different conditions.
Thank you, Boris.
So I have a few general observations to make first about the symposium overall and the fear of art as a subject. I think it's already been noted, but this fear of art really signals art's power to surface critical issues, to ignite conversation and controversy around these issues. And it signals art's power to contribute to social change. So what is so threatening about art? What are people afraid of? It's the value of art to push us out of our comfort zone and to challenge conventions, including what subjects and materials are deemed appropriate, and to continually challenge art forms, what art's form and purpose are in society, to raise questions about taboo subjects, to expose corruption and inequality, and to break the past, to create the new, as someone said last night. At the new museum, as Svetlana said, our mission is to support these questions and artists who are committed to testing the line of acceptability and the meaning of terms like appropriate, good taste, beauty, and so on. And so we have a very long history of mounting presentations by artists like Bob Flanagan, Andres Serrano, David Wanarovich, the Critical Art Ensemble, Paul McCarthy, Chris O'Feely, and many others, so many others that are not necessarily deemed acceptable by other mainstream institutions and have been touchstones of the culture wars. Artists do have the right to disrespect and be offensive, and most of the important art was deemed offensive when it was first made and shown, because it changes how we see the world, and artists often see changes coming before the rest of us do. So that's one explanation for what is so threatening, what people are afraid of. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that I think the media coverage of culture really stokes fears about it. And the mass media likes to focus on art in two ways in our country, as scandal and controversy, and as money. And the two often support each other. It's a very sensationalistic approach to culture that reinforces the feeling that art is dangerous and threatening to our values, or that it's something that should be highly suspect as overvalued and underregulated haven for money laundering, possibly a complete sham perpetrated by a conspiracy of corrupt investors. So you have those two narratives going on, and they often reinforce each other. Censorship is a very complex subject, complicated, as we've heard over and over, by cultural context, laws and values of where the art is made in and for whom. And even in a democratic society like ours, where we enjoy the privilege of free speech and where free speech is a basic human right, censorship still persists. First Amendment protection is not absolute. There are exclusions, there are limits, but those limits are never fixed. And there's so many gray areas, which I find the most interesting to look at, that place of nuance. So self-censorship is even grayer because we can't see it. We often can't see it. We can't point to it. And sometimes those doing it may not even realize that they're doing it, or it's called by some other name. And I've heard time and time again when people describe incidents of self-censorship, they say, I hesitate to call it that because it's not quite that. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. So it is more pervasive and pernicious, and it's because it's not tied, as you said, to prescriptions about moral and political judgments necessarily, but a whole host of other things come into it. I'm sure we've all had an experience of this at some point on the broad spectrum. Everyone has a line of tolerance, and when you sense that you're going to be pushed beyond that line, you may preemptively decide not to engage. It could be an intolerance for abusive behavior, for putting the public at risk through unsafe conditions. It may be an unwillingness to violate public regulations and codes of law where you might lose the trust of public officials that you rely on. Or it may be an unwillingness to insult funders, as has been brought up. It could also arise out of a sense of responsibility to protect the rights of your public, including privacy rights, for instance. So we often, as institutions, face conflicting responsibilities. What happens when these responsibilities are clashing? And I think we saw that, we see that in the New York Times decision not to publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, and Dean Baquet saying that out of respect to our readers, we've avoided those that we felt were offensive. Many Muslims consider publishing images of their prophet innately offensive, and we have refrained from doing so. So that's a clear example of that. We all know that it's a myth that the museum or the newspaper is a neutral platform, but yet we do exist as a site for the contest of ideas. And we all have strongly held passionate beliefs and political beliefs that sometimes we have to rein in, but of course we can't. We do set the platform for debate, but we're very eager to define liberal ideals. And I, in thinking about this panel, had to ask about what about when we're asked to defend other kinds of ideals? What about, I mean, we support the far left, but what about the far right? What happens when we're dealing with work about white supremacy or Tea Party sentiments or racist, sexist points of view, right to lifers, these kinds of things? That's really where I think we're much more likely to self-select and self-censor, and it's not something that I think we really talk about, but we have to. Noam Chomsky said that if we don't believe in the freedom of expression for people we despise, then we don't believe in it at all. And so that's something I'm really interested in thinking about. And that brings me to the case study. Would you mind just, thank you, Svetlana, just popping that on. Thanks. This is a recent, it's a case of a sculpture that was put on view at the University of Iowa this past December by the artist Serhat Tanyalokar. And the sculpture, as you can see, is of a Ku Klux Klan figure, which is plastered with press stories about racial violence in America. And the artist intended this as a statement against racism, highlighting America's history of race-based violence. It immediately ignited a firestorm of petitions, controversy, Twitter posts, and op-eds. Students felt intimidated by this piece, and they called for its removal. It was deemed deeply offensive by university authorities, and many faculty members and students referred to it as a form of hate speech. The display was put up in a free speech zone on campus, an outdoor area that was designated as a public forum. But it was considered abhorrent, and it was promptly removed. The artist then issued an apology. I think this is such an interesting case because it highlights so many of the complexities that exist in defining meaning and the frequent misunderstanding and misrepresentation of artists and their intention. And also the flashpoint of public space, as Jeffrey mentioned, and what happens when you're in that public-private zone. It's a whole different set of criteria. And then, though this was not hate speech, it does bring up the question of what is that line between hate speech and freedom of expression. The figure of the Klansman is one of the most terrifying in our country. It's a vivid reminder of the persistence of our darkest chapter, and it remains a touchstone of race-based violence no matter what the intent. It's really our swastika and taboo. It's a taboo form. It reminds me of other Klan images in art, and there's just a couple of more images I wanted to show. This by the artist William Christenberry, who created a series of Klan dolls and a Klan room, coming to terms with the racism and terrorism and injustice that he witnessed growing up in the South in the 50s and 60s, and his own personal experience with the Klan. But as a white artist, he was seen as fetishizing and glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, and very few museums in the US, including the Whitney, would show it. I was at the Whitney at the time, and we considered this project, but ultimately decided not to exhibit it. In 1979, someone broke into his studio and stole this entire room. It's never been discovered who it was, if it was the Klan or a fan. He still doesn't know. So I ask you to consider the case at the University of Iowa as an interesting example that reminds us of how far away we are from a point of common ground and a society of shared values. This is an ideal of both civil society and our public institutions. And we really have a long way to go, so I'm going to end there. Oh, that's fine. Thank
you. A lot has been said about censorship and self-censorship. As Svalanta requested, I'll speak about one case that I had to deal with. Yet, of course, I come from a place where censorship was part of the actual machine of oppression that we had to face. I remember that in the 80s, well up to the first Intifada, there were laws, or what they called military orders. I've just dug up one military order now, Military Order 181, that Article 6, that specifically forbade the Palestinians to publish, and I quote from this military order, any publication, advertisement, proclamation, or picture, or any other document which contains any article with a political significance. And of course, you know, that's very, very broad. I mean, well, how do you define political significance? But maybe I want to kind of jump right into the case that I want to bring up to you, and I want to skip a lot that I wrote, but I think has been said in so many different ways, and I think more articulate than I would put it. So I would just ask my question: how do I deal with self-censorship, and how do we, in this kind of context, how do we, as artists, as curators, as directors of institutions, how do we deal with that? So in the Palestinian Museum, which is, of course, now I spoke about it briefly, being built in Birzeit in the West Bank, and its network being established in different parts of the world, and slated to open in 2016. I come across this issue of censorship almost, you know, every day. Our organization is an organization that is in many ways very vulnerable, scrutinized on all sides, as you can imagine. We are endlessly treading the fine line between endangering our own survival as an institution built in occupied territory and in the midst of a highly volatile political situation, and losing, on the other hand, of course, our integrity as a vehicle of expression and empowerment for the diverse Palestinian people. So if we censor what we say too much in order to retain a certain type of funding or avoid offending sectors of the public, we risk losing our right to speak at all on behalf of those we claim to serve. On the other hand, if we are not careful, subtle, and nuanced in the way we express certain political and, I think, moral messages, in this case, we run the different risk of these messages falling on deaf ears. And an example, and I'm bringing this up here, concerns one of our most recent projects, an installation designed as part of the celebration of the Pope's visit to Palestine. We were asked to decorate, so to speak, the manger square in Bethlehem and the Dheisheh refugee camp reception hall where the Pope visited, with a series of images that emerged, or that kind of merged, I should say, Baroque religious art, mostly scenes from the life of Christ, as you see here, with contemporary photographs of Palestinians living under the occupation. The project was about exploring the different ways we think of the Holy Land and about what it has meant to live here through the ages. It was also a meditation on the portrayal of Christian suffering and Christian values of mercy, compassion, and truth. And this is exactly what we wanted to say through the Pope's visit. So if we look at this painting of Caravaggio, we see that when Thomas is asked to put his hand, you know, to verify the identity of Christ, I switched that with the identity card that is given to Palestinians, which has a very particular color, which is green, being here checked by a soldier. Another one that shows the beheading of John the Baptist. Again, another Caravaggio. And it's self-explanatory. I don't need to say much about these things. Several of these images I'm showing here were censored by the Palestinian Authority as being too confrontational and inappropriate to be presented to the Pope. They thought the Pope would be embarrassed in the international media as having implicitly endorsed these images, which we, of course, eventually excluded. On the other hand, one of the images that we eventually decided not to include contained a photograph of Rachel Corrie, the girl who got killed by an Israeli bulldozer in 2003 in Gaza. This was partly out of respect for her family, but was also partly out of fear of taking an already, in the eyes of some, controversial project too far, damaging, thus, its overall reception. It was an extraordinary image, one of the ones which I was most proud of, and I still wonder whether it would have been so bad to include it. Because as it was, I think the project made its points without it. Sometimes you have to accept that the time is not right. If you want to be part of change, maybe you also have to be prepared to be cautious. Self-censorship then, in my opinion, is to some degree inevitable. In some instances, it is even advisable. There is nothing wrong with picking one's battles. I think what we have to do when we are faced with these decisions ourselves is not simply to push instinctively at the boundaries potentially restricting us, but also to push ourselves, to examine our motivations, to interrogate our moral compasses, to examine our political context in terms not only of what we can get away with, or what we generally, or what will generate capital or publicity, but most importantly, what would make a difference for the people one cares most for. Thank you.
That was wonderful. There's so many questions, and I'd like people on the panel to think of questions to each other, but I will start. As there are issues here about space and community, and when we talk about offense first, we are at a point of time where we're discussing very much to what extent should we, yes, people get really offended. It's not imaginary. Should we try to not offend? But then also, when you're deciding to self-censor because of consideration for the feelings of others, who are those others? How are we? We always talk about community sensitivities. We're living in a world with very diverse communities. So when you're protecting one community, are you then stopping another part of the community from seeing something? And I'm very much familiar with the blue mural, and there was a demonstration against the whitewashing where veterans participated. They did this laser projection on the wall. So you might have veterans that would be pleased by this combination of, the message of the mural, which is about money and war. So my question to all of you is, when you're thinking of these issues, how do you think about community? And who can speak for a community? Who can say, my community is offended? Bringing the Ophelia and the Brooklyn Museum, there were people speaking for the Catholic community saying, well, this is so hurtful to our feelings. So who do we allow the power to speak for and to hence cause censorship?
Well, I have to respond to the Ophelia example because there was an idea about something being offensive that really didn't match up with the reality of the work, and it often wasn't experienced. I mean, it wasn't experienced by Giuliani, who attacked it, and so it became this symbolic thing. It really wasn't. It wasn't the community speaking out. It was a wedge that was used in a political battle. When we exhibited that work, The Holy Virgin Mary, recently at the New Museum, we went to several people that we know high up in the Catholic Church and spoke to them about it. And they had a very different attitude about it than what has come to be kind of legend around the piece in its first reception, which is, it may not be appropriate in a church, but it is appropriate in an art context and in an artwork. So there was much greater openness than we're led to believe. Mm-hmm. I'm not quite answering that.
Well, first of all, I think you cannot manage not to offend people. And I think to offend people, in some cases, is a good thing to do. Of course, if they don't kill you, yeah. But also maybe in this case, yeah, objectively, not for you, but generally. Because it provokes a reaction and it makes clear the attitude that maybe was not so clear before it. It makes things more open, yeah, and more clear. And that is always a part of enlightenment, if you want, yeah. Actually, enlightenment operated by that. Yeah, enlightenment actually in many ways was not an explanation, was not a theory, just people offended other people, yeah, and just in reaction to this offense, yeah, especially Rousseau is a good example, Voltaire, they systematically offend people, and their reaction suddenly demonstrated something that was not clear before. And I brought this Pussy Riot story, for example. I also participated in the discussion, and I was very much for this action because I believed it clarified the attitudes and the position of Russian Orthodox Church. For many decades, Russian Orthodox Church in Russia was very much persecuted. Thousands of priests were killed and churches were burned, and also this cathedral of Christ the Savior was also destroyed during the Soviet and power, and then reconstructed. So a lot of people in Russia didn't realize that today church is a ally of the power and not an enemy. It was not clear for the people. I think it became clear for everybody after this event. Yeah, it became clear that relationship between state and church now is not what it was before. And so I think this kind of clarification, even it is dangerous and problematic in many ways and hurtful, this clarification is actually good.
We hope that these confrontations lead to more understanding. And the point is that a dialogue results, and there is communication between the various communities to talk about the meaning of these issues. And that's partly what we're doing now. That's a lot of what happened in Los Angeles.
I mean, I think that's a very good point in terms of how do we manage to avoid self-censorship because of offense? And I think, what you're saying, having a conversation rather than, oh, we are offended, we're going to remove this, is a very productive way to go. Did it happen? In your case, it didn't happen. Do you have examples of such conversation that have helped deal with a controversy of people saying we're offended, and then you bring them in, and you can keep the work, but have a conversation about that?
Yeah, I can tell you about Sharjah. I mean, for those who know, Sharjah, a very conservative place. But it's interesting what Jeffrey presented, because within the museum space, within the space of the exhibition, within the biennial space, these conversations and negotiations were taking place. So we were able to push the boundaries of what is permissible and not through these conversations, on one hand with the artists, and then at the same time with the government or the representative of the government. But long story short, these conversations are cushioned, and they're within that protective environment. Once you go out of that environment, as was the case with this work that you showed, Jeffrey, and was the case with the work that got me fired, was when that artwork was in a space that was not controlled, and where a conversation was not easy to take place, because it's outside on the street, and to talk with everybody on the street is practically impossible. So this is what happened, and this is again another good example of what happened in LA MoCA.
And that brings the issue of space and containment. And we have the confines, the frame of the museum, where you could see very material that could be quite radical in its ideas, but this is the museum, and it is okay there. And we also have increasingly art in public space, art that you don't have to go into the museum to see, art that reaches a lot more audiences, and controversies around this art are very much more alive. And there was a Fred Wilson proposed monument in Indianapolis that was eventually shut down. There was a little small group that vehemently opposed it. It was a monument to slavery. And some people were saying, well, if it's in the museum, it would be okay, but not in public space. So I'm curious about that, because we do want a public space that's not solely advertising, a public space that has art that is, Jeffrey Deitch has done so much for street art. I mean, street art it's in the street. It makes political statements. It could offend people. It's part of a kind of civil dialogue, way more than if it's conserved in the museum to an art audience that already is in the know. So is it possible to make this transition? That is where, how can we have an open public space for art?
With street art, see, what I did was something unusual, of actually presenting street art in the context of a public museum. Of course, 99% of street art, the artists just do it, and they don't ask anyone for permission, and whatever happens, happens. So the issue that I faced was taking this unruly, unsanctioned medium and maybe trying to tame it for a museum audience. And that was part of the conflict. But luckily, street artists can still, within their ability to dodge the legal system, do whatever they want and present whatever they think. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to present art like this beyond the system of museums, commercial galleries, biennials.
It's very difficult for museums to dodge the legal system, and that's where difficulties often arise. So I don't know how many of you are aware, but we have some regulations in New York City that make it very difficult to present certain kinds of public works in the public sphere. There are building code regulations, for instance, that prohibit projections of images with any text in them. This is something that's not very well known to the public, but it's really limiting the kind of art that can be seen in public spaces. And the ruling, I think it exists in Los Angeles as well, that it was really made to control guerrilla advertising efforts where people are just going around the city with trucks and projecting ads on buildings. And so it was really an effort to protect the public sphere, but it's had the effect of really limiting the kinds of artistic expression that can exist on the walls of buildings.
But on the other hand, it's always possible to organize, for example, events and performances in the street and the public spaces. And there are many examples from all around the world of very efficient and very radical gesture. They could be short-lived, but they can be documented, and as documentation also shown and distributed. And one find, I don't want to take too much time, but one really can find examples here in this country and other countries of pretty radical, interesting work of art in form of performances, public spaces, not only the streets, but also in warehouses, also in supermarkets and so on.
Both have to be underground. Wouldn't have institutional support.
No, they not necessarily had to have official institutional support at the moment. They actually are practiced, yeah. But after they took place, after they are documented, after there's a video and photographs and commentaries, this work can be also shown in the museum. Yeah, nobody prevents you to do so. Yeah? So in this case, you have a possibility of doing your work without any official institutional support, but at the same time, use the support for the material.
Do you have questions for each other? I don't want to. Well, I want to stay on this issue of space. And how does space change the meaning of a work? You know, yes, you can show it in a museum institutionally, but what happens? Well, you know, Ariane keeps quoting Picasso that art should be dangerous. If it's chase, it's not art. So we're trying to make it less dangerous, you know, less offensive, less inflammatory, putting it in the frame of the museum. Is that an action of, you know, disempowering it in a way? By trying not to be offensive, by being concerned about all these communities and how we present, even in the museum, the framing of the art, the kind of the educational text around it is very careful. So what, isn't there something in, you know, if we're talking about the potency of art that requires it to be disturbing in some way, to appear in spaces where you're not predictably going to encounter it?
Yes, I think it's a part of the game, because if we speak about perspective of mutual understanding, yeah, between all the communities and arts and so on, I think this perspective are deemed or impossible to reach in many cases. So in many cases, it is more interesting and more productive even just to clarify the fronts here without any mutual understanding. I think that if you want to really make a point, then you have to be confrontational. And if you are confrontational, you are not necessarily can reckon with understanding of the others. But it's not bad, yeah. I mean, it's a crazy part of the game.
Well, I'd like to open to the audience. There's a mic here and a mic on the other side. Sir, can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Fred Parvenet. I have a general question for any of the panelists. I'm not an artist. I studied engineering. I'm a banker now. But something struck to me in 9th grade that has pretty much stayed with me all these years. It's a quote from George Orwell that said, "All art is propaganda." Do any of you believe in that? Do you think it's correct? Just curious.
I think I would answer, art is fundamentally different from propaganda. And propaganda is something that I'm very interested in, advocate, but art is not just about making a political point. It's much deeper. It's about a much deeper changing of consciousness, opening up perception. So I think it's a fundamental difference.
I would say that all art is ideological, and no matter what its form, it does represent a certain politics and a certain set of values. So maybe that's partially what he meant.
Oh, there was somebody on this side, so let's switch sides.
Yes, hi. My name is Rebecca Hackerman, and I'm currently doing my PhD on public art in New York, and I'm an artist. I'm currently making machines on the streets that study other public art that are made outside of what you've called the public art machine. And at CAA, we were talking about this fear of public discourse and publicity of art that exists in the public sphere. And some of the administrators mentioned that they had been asked not to announce their projects to the press, to the popular press. And I'm wondering if you had thoughts about that, or if you had ever been asked not to announce projects that were in the public sphere.
I'm not quite sure what the question is.
I think the question was,
I'm
were there projects that they saw as an institution not appropriate to announce? The project just happened?
I mean, I think if it's an unofficial project that's like you're suggesting, then maybe it's better you don't announce it. Yeah.
But I mean, if
you don't want to alert officials if you're doing something unofficially.
Well, no, these
perhaps.
were administrators and curators of public projects, not the artists, and they were asked by the city not to talk about it too much. So that to avoid controversy. And we were talking about this sort of fear of public discourse about work in the public sphere that's done within the, not work that's just done by the artists themselves, but art that's done on the aegis of other institutions and funding bodies. So have you ever been asked not to announce something?
No.
Many cases.
Yeah, by the officials. By the officials.
I think secrecy is a good thing in general.
Hi, good evening. My name is Savannah Bailey McLean. I am a public art curator. I curate in New York City. I do it all the time. I deal with the city all the time. I was quite surprised by the statements that were made. Very disappointed. I loved the conference, but I noticed also that there was no African American on any of the panels, nobody of Latino background whatsoever. And I'm seeing a panel of kind of, privileged people who are talking about how they do public art. When I have to deal with public art, I have to engage the community before I present the work. I have to talk to people, I walk the neighborhood, I go to community board meetings, I meet with residents, neighbors, restaurant owners, all before I put that piece out there. So therefore they understand what I'm doing. I'm not asking them to like it or dislike it, but I want them to at least understand. And all the work that I do is site-specific. So I engage the history, the architecture, the culture of the people in that neighborhood so they can get it. at least one aspect that they can get it. So my statement to you is the reason why you're having problems is because you're doing it from this point instead of engaging people. And for the museum, because I really do have a beef with the new museum, is that you guys don't reach out to those who are actually doing real good work. It's all the money contained in your museum. You don't partner with other groups who are doing aggressive, progressive work. And so therefore, it looks like you're doing something when you're not. And one day when you do decide to work with groups, you can give me a call. Thank you.
Thank you for your observations. Yeah, we have a lot of collaborative projects. I just want you to know, and maybe you want to check some of them out. We really believe in collaboration, and we have many, many collaborations going on, including a project called Ideas City, which looks at the future of cities with culture as its driving force, with over 250 community partners, including educational groups and community groups, and it's quite diverse. And we work with the community very actively in developing this program. So we are quite proactive in going out into the community to develop many of the programs that we do. So I hope you'll look at that. Thanks. Good. Okay. Okay. You want it?
I have nothing to do with that.
Jack, from your perspective, do you do community negotiation or negotiate with the state? Like, who do you, because you come from a different...
No, we're from a completely different planet. We're not allowed to do anything in public spaces. And we don't deal with the city. We boycott the city, of course. So there is no relation with the... So what we do is all clandestine work. So our work is based on partnerships with community centers, youth clubs, schools, all sorts of different grassroots organizations, and through them we do the work. So we organize an annual show called the Jerusalem Show, and it takes place in several places in the city in order for us to reach out to this community, but we do it through the community. So the artists we work with kind of are embedded in these organizations, and the projects are created over time with relation to this. But if we put something out in the public, it will be taken down immediately. It's not allowed. We cannot operate in the public space. So it's a completely different place.
But, and Jeffrey, you said you had a conversation with the community after the dialogue, after the mural.
Oh, sure. Well, see, this was an unusual situation where Blue structured this so that what I normally would have done of introducing him to people in the community first, and so that he understands the context, he wanted to do it a different way. He wanted to basically create havoc. And that's part of what he does. He's that kind of artist. And he is very proud that, for instance, a graffiti festival in Italy, he got there first, did something so provocative, the entire thing was shut down. And that for him was great. None of the other artists had an opportunity to present their work. So this contrasts, let's say, what we did with JR, who spent months in the community taking photographs of elderly people in Little Tokyo, and the mural was a dialogue with the community, very much embraced, and it stayed up for a year after the show because people found it very meaningful. Many of the street artists, let's say, swoon. They pride themselves on connecting with the community while they're doing their work, and that's very much part of it. The community's invited in. And you see that classic image of Keith Haring working years ago. There'd be 100 kids from the neighborhood watching him and engaging. and sometimes participating. So that's part of the ethic, and I agree with what the speaker mentioned, and I wish that I had been able to do that in a more embracing way, but this was, again, was a very unusual situation.
Do you think that sometimes those, I'll give you the word, the kind of the conversation with the community sometimes could lead to pre-censorship? In a way that the artists, that be, you know, in the same, again, the Fred Wilson case comes to mind, where a small section of the community put a lot of pressure, so that at some point the foundation funding the work pulled funding and canceled the project. So, how much of a community veto should there be? There should be a conversation, but should there be a veto from the community?
I think when you're a community organization, like a publicly supported museum, there has to be, when it's outside the boundaries of the museum itself, there has to be a dialogue. When you are an artist on your own and you just want to put something out there, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, I agree that when the work is in the public sphere, it's important to engage the context around it and the community around it. But within the museum, there are so many communities that we're talking about. It's not just the local community, it's the international community, it's the community of artists, it's the community of supporters, it's multiple communities. So that word community is complex, with often conflicting values and opinions.
Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that at the new museum? With this kind of the undefinable imaginary community, who is?
We talk to the people that come to the museum. We have lots of discussions in social media and online, and we have public forums all the time. So the discussion is ongoing.
Hi, I'm Nitin Sahni. I teach in the faculty here, and I'm delighted to see Jack and everyone on the panel. Thank you for your really honest assessment and the lessons you've learned. I think it's hard to discuss these kinds of very difficult cases. I was going to interrogate Jeffrey about the experience of that project, and I was very empathetic to the woman who just spoke about that kind of community engagement and site specificity. I mean, I wonder about the responsibility we have as curators in designing a process that allows that to unfold effectively. I've been trying to develop a curatorial project in Guatemala where we hosted a series of workshops with artists and the communities in the process of making the call for proposals, and then did an open call and so on. So we had the whole process of thinking through issues of genocide, historic memory, and we knew how difficult it was going to be to do that, so we had to have all these workshops in place before we could even curate the program. So it's a responsibility on our part, and I wonder in the context of the MoCA, if you had set up a process in place where the graffiti artist could have worked with another social scientist, community member in advance to think about the site specificity and re-engage in a more effective way. So I mean, I feel like the curators really have to be present, and this was the case in Sharjah, I think, when Jack's experience with Rasha Salti. You know, what are ways the curators have to be much more sensitive and engaged with the places where they are accountable? So because we are institutions, we are accountable at the New School to do things that serve the New School's mission in a way that isn't distracting from our purpose. So that is part of our responsibility. And I just want to bring an anecdote from Jack. I worked with Jack a couple of years ago in Palestine, and we did a project before the Jerusalem show where we got a little bit of funding from the Palestinian Authority for a project, but it was being shown in Jack's foundation in his museum, in his gallery space, which is part of Israel, occupied by Israel. And when the catalog came out, Jack was horrified because it said funded by Palestinian Authority in the catalog. And immediately Jack told me, we can't have these in our gallery space because Israel will essentially shut us down. So all the catalogs went into the refrigerator, and we had to open the show without the catalogs. And I'm wondering, Jack, if this is still the case.
It is.
Okay, so this is constant censorship now.
Just to jump in before you. Yeah, this is, I mean, it was, Jerusalem, as I said in the previous session, Jerusalem was signed off in the Oslo Accords. So in the Accords, it said that, you know, they set up the PA and everything, but this PA cannot, this Palestinian Authority cannot work in Jerusalem, cannot fund anything in Jerusalem, cannot be involved in anything in Jerusalem. So if there's anything that has the mention of the Palestinian Authority, or if some whatever official, Palestinian official comes to an opening of any event in Jerusalem, the event will be shut down immediately. So that's why your catalog, you know, kind of, and when I looked at it, it was like, are you trying to shut us down or what? You know, you know, you can't do these things. You have to be always,
Sorry about that.
you know.
I was just wondering about the question about the curatorial process engaging site specificity, which I wasn't sure if we've addressed.
I think you have to follow the artist. So in Art in the Streets, for instance, Banksy, under deep cover, worked for 2 months in a public school. And the entire student body was there working on a giant version of a stained glass window that was exhibited in the show. And they didn't know it was Banksy. They just thought it was a community art project. So some artists are very interested in that. Others, like Blue, that's not of interest. So I think you follow the artist.
So maybe speaking about community, I had an example, following example, I organized a big exhibition, really big, in Karlsruhe, which is a part of Baden-Württemberg, under the title Medium Religion. And it was about how different religions, also Christian denominations, Islam and Buddhism, I don't know, present themselves in media, and mostly videos that they produced, and also how artists react to that. It was a big exhibition. And Baden-Württemberg is a very Catholic part of Germany, and actually in all the German newspapers, I got the same reviews, began always with same lines. I am personally atheist and non-believer, but I find it very strange that the true Catholic Church is mixed with all these wrong religions. Yeah? So how would I negotiate this point of view with the community? Yeah? Which on the one hand, non-Catholic, the non-believers, they are modern people. On the other hand, they believe that Catholic Church is only one true religion. Yeah? So how you negotiate such an exhibition? You can simply do it, and that's it, yeah? And get negative reaction. Okay, leave it.
Yeah, so it doesn't kill you.
Do you have another question?
Hi. My question is, so we're talking about like offense and being offended as one general thing, and I was wondering if you guys saw a difference between like offending people who are in power and people who are not in power, marginalized versus not. Jeffrey Deitch, in the example you gave, I saw really I had a different reaction to the Japanese Americans with the story of the internment and everything like that being offended versus the VA being offended, and I feel like I would have a different reaction with the VA hospital being offended versus a different government institution being offended. And the same with Boris Groys with the Russian Orthodox Church, and it's sort of changing relationship. One way it would be offended, like in the way that it was offended and the way that you're talking about, you sort of found out that it was in power again, or was more like complicit with power when before it would have been different. And so just, are there different kinds of offensive? Is something offensive to different people? Is that different? Do you react to it differently?
If you react to what I said about to be offensive is a good thing, I don't want to be offensive to everybody. Yeah, you like say, I generally want to be offensive and offend everybody I see for different reasons. No, I simply do what I like to do, and if it happens that it can offend somebody, I'm sorry about it, but I don't take it back. Yeah, that's it. And I don't want to specifically offend anybody. I don't think that artists want to offend anybody specifically. In a certain situations, there are ideological confrontations or religious confrontations, so I are for something for a certain point against certain point, and then you offend your, let's say, enemies, ideological enemies or religious enemies. That happens. But it doesn't mean that you want to be generally totally offensive against everybody. I think it's only Satan, as it is described in Holy Scripture, has this kind of general offensive desire, general desire to be offensive.
I can give you an example, which I wouldn't have even, kind of thought that it might be offensive. One artist in one of the shows, the Jerusalem show, which, as I said, takes place in different parts of the city, produced a plaque, green, and written on it, God is love, in Arabic, Allah mahabba. And it's written in it in a script that looks very much like the signs that especially, people connected to mosques put out with the words of God. So they hang it outside the mosque, and they hang it sometimes in the streets. God is love, this verse comes from the most important, the most celebrated Arab singer, diva, Kulthum. And it's in one of her very famous songs where she says, God is this, God is that, and God is love. And everybody knows this phrase. But when he produced this and he hung it in several places in the city, in the old city, I think people looked at it from a more kind of a Christian, what would be a kind of Christian message rather than a Muslim, an Islamic message. I don't know why, if it's more like Christians who would say God is love rather than Muslims who would say God is love. Anyway, it ended up that all the signs, and there were many, 20, I don't know how many, were broken along the line where it says God and then is love, and they threw away is love and kept the God sign. So like a day or two later, all over the city, it was only God, 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 and love was thrown away. So they got offended. I don't know why. I mean, I'm guessing. I'm just guessing, but yeah, some people get offended.
I'm wondering, in this kind of, offenses, people interpret things differently, so they can interpret them as offensive. But we also have a kind of, global internet and clicktivism. And, there are these petitions to stop something because it is offensive, and it makes its way around the world, and it could shut down a show, as it did recently at the Barbican, because can you, as people that are responsible for institutions, how do you respond to those threats? And I think there probably would be more of them, because you can misrepresent a work, you can get a global audience, and you could get 25,000 signatures on change.org and say, this is offensive to us, we don't want this, and there might be violence. What would your response be?
Can't do much about it. People take it.
A recent example in Mexico City,
Yeah.
they petitioned to have Herman Nish not present a solo show there. Basically, animal activists involved, played animals, etc.
No, I just want to repeat this because it's not on the mic. In Mexico City, they recently canceled the Herman Nietzsche show because of animal activists threatening violence.
Circulating the internet petition for change.org.
Circulating a change.org petition to cancel the show.
Yeah, I don't think that was the right decision to cancel the show. But I think that these inflamed emotions are a great opportunity to have the discussion about what it is that's upsetting people, about what people are afraid of or objecting to or find offensive. And you can always have multiple points of view on those things. And I think it's good to just have the conversation, use the museum as a platform to discuss that, but not back down because one group finds something offensive. Someone will always find something offensive. And you know, that is just going to shut off all expression if we start succumbing to that. Now, threats of violence, if they're real, is something else. That's a whole other level of consideration, which you might want to speak to. But.
I'm not going to.
No. Okay. I don't care.
Well, it's very hard to establish. You know, we had the Sony film, The Interview, was projections were being canceled under very vague threats of violence. But again, could you take the risk? And you know, when the New York Times did not publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, partly they didn't want to offend. Partly, I believe there is a level of fear because it did happen. It could happen.
I can tell you that the Palestinian Museum in itself was something offensive to some people, and we got a lot of hate mail when we announced it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when we produced these images that I just showed you, we also got a lot of offensive and hate mail. Unfortunately, from Israelis. Of
Did you respond to it in any way? Mm-hmm.
No, I can't respond. What do you want to say to somebody who says, oh, this museum should be the next target bombing after Gaza, or this museum is all about, you know, terrorists, and it's going to show whatever.
So dialogue only takes us so far. There are people that don't want to dialogue with you.
Yeah. So, I mean, you cannot respond to these things. You cannot allow it. And as I told you in this other example of this God is love, I mean, people did it themselves, you know, just went there and broke it. And so if it's in the public domain, people can do whatever they want with it. They can send hate mail, they can break it, they can object to it, they can try to stop it if they deem it offensive.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Joanna Matuszak, and I'm a doctoral student at Indiana University in Bloomington, working on Russian performance art for my dissertation, 1990s. So my question goes predominantly to Dr. Groys, and I'm thinking about public spaces. And you mentioned performance, very important genre for post-Soviet Russian art, but I'm particularly interested, what's your point of view on the state or future and prospects of developing performance art, but community-based performance art based on dialogue with non-art communities, non-art public, and you know, working in the public space, but sort of together with a communities. Am I clear in my question? If not, I will try to rephrase.
Yeah, if it's directed to me, it's difficult for me to answer this question. To make advertisement for myself, I just curated, opened a couple of days ago, an exhibition here in two places, James Gallery at CUNY and Efflux Space, a selection of Russian artists now very active in Moscow and in New York, and very political. Some of them with very offensive attitudes. And, well, that's, for example, artists and artworks that I like. That is why I exhibited them here in New York. I would like to exhibit them also in Moscow, if I am invited to do so, the same selection. If I'm not allowed to do that, I don't do anything at all. Yeah? So I think that should be a kind of clear attitude. So either you get certain kind of freedom, or you protest that you don't. Yeah, and mostly, if you look at what happens in Russia in last years, recent years, there is no censorship in a Soviet sense of this word. That means that you can basically do whatever you want. Yeah, the pressure comes after the opening, not before, and that can be very unpleasant. Yeah, in many cases, and especially if it concerns religion, politics too, but religions especially. So it can be also violent, yeah, in certain cases, as we know, yeah. So that gives to the curator a certain margin, so they have to take a certain risk. Maybe it happens, maybe it will not happen, yeah. The problem is the situation is unpredictable even for people that have a lot of experience like Gilman and so on. Yeah. So you really can't say. It's really risk-taking if speaking about Russian situation. And I do not think that it's possible to alleviate the situation by speaking to these so-called communities, yeah, because they simply hate you, yeah, and so you can speak to them until the end of the times, yeah. It doesn't change anything. So you take risk or you don't, yeah. So that's.
Thank you.
Hi, Bruce Rosen. Your discussion of the site-specific graffiti and the impact of doing that kind of art and then trying to move it seems to me to raise a number of things. Because there's been a lot of, as discussed over here, site-specific art that's sometimes been transitory, that's been successful, like the repo art or the multi-year and multi-destination surveillance camera players when surveillance cameras were appearing, or what's going to happen again, the Chalk Project, which commemorates the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which is in March. So those things do get through. The example of the Mocha thing with both the context of this Draincy or Westerbork-like setting that fortunately did not end in a final solution for those people reminded me immediately of the Nazi march in Skokie, which whenever it's raised, the context is never brought up, that the community had the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors in the country, and that's not in the discussion. And I think those similar kinds of things are not there. That got raised with a federal building in Lower Manhattan, which was to be expanded onto the site of the African burial ground. And there was a lot that was involved with that. But I have to, one is correct you, it wasn't Peter Vallone, it was Peter Vallone Jr., his son, who was in the council. The son was far more conservative than the father. There's not always progression through generations. Sometimes there's a regression. He introduced a number of bills in the council that were anti-graffiti, but I think also in his district, and you would know this for several decades, you had a canvas of a building, 5 points for graffiti artists, which a few years ago was.
Do you have a question?
Well, to put it out there, what comes out with the Brooklyn Museum in particular is that there you have an institution that's been subject to misrepresentations and harsher standards in the media as the second largest public art collection in the country. When it had the Chris of Philly work there, which was part of a more controversial exhibit, there was the threats by the mayor to kick the museum out of this public building. There was a tremendous rally in support of the museum.
I have to ask you to ask your question, because we have a long history of
no one paid
censorship.
attention. No one paid attention to the fact that the same exhibit had a feminist artist with a huge canvas with the Christ of Last Supper Christ-like figure, a female, bare-breasted, got no attention. But also, the so-called #1 museum had a coward of a head, Philip de Montebello. He took the stance of the mayor and supported him. So what I liked is this intersection of power, of money, which shuts down what you can show, so that even you, if you don't, which you've raised every time with the catalogs over here. So I really think that you have to go further into this in your discussion.
Well, so we have one last question.
Jeannie Hopper from Clock Tower Radio and WBAI. My question is for Jack. Jack, can you talk a little bit about the Palestinian Biennale you did? I was a journalist actually in the Gaza Strip and in Israel and the West Bank for a bit between 90 and 93. And all of my material I gathered was subject to being passed by the censors. So how on earth did you, what's the topic? The role of self-censorship and such, because you were in Haifa as well, so you were in Israel proper as well as operating in Palestine. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
How did I what? Sorry. How did I?
How did you apply the self-censorship when you're talking about presenting the Palestinian Biennale within, like Haifa, for instance, that's in Israel, versus, you know, in the actual Palestinian territories? So what kind of self-censorship did you, was it different when you were in Haifa versus when you were in actually?
No. This self-censorship doesn't apply, or censorship, to this particular case, to the Biennale in Palestine. Okay. The Biennale is structured around the concept of people connecting to each other and organizations working together in order to produce this event. So it is not your typical biennial where there is a director and an artistic director and you know, people who are responsible to select and to direct the event. The concept tries to pull together as many partners as possible from these disparate and disconnected parts of Palestine together and go against everything there to create an impression of unity. I mean, unity is physically impossible, but to kind of give that impression. And so what we do with Qalandia International, that's the name of it, is to find and locate partners. Each partner is responsible for the program they organize, is responsible for you know, the audience, is responsible for you know, everything, the logistics and everything within their own particular area. But we agree that we do communications together, i.e. all of these programs of the different partners come together under this umbrella that is called Qalandia International Biennial. And hence, when you're here and or you know, even in Palestine, and you read about it, you think about it as one entity, as one event. But it's actually the last edition was in 26 different places, organized by 13 different organizations. And even though we had a theme, but that theme was very loose and open. It was about archives. The different institutions responded to this idea, but at different levels and at different intensities. But there was no censorship exercise or self-censorship. The only example that I mentioned here, which was the Palestinian Museum project for the Pope, was that, you know, kind of very special situation where it's a commission from the Palestinian Authority to do something for the Pope, and it had even though it might be that the authority wanted to show something, they double-checked that with the head of the church, the local, like the chargé of the Holy See, who's the representative of the Pope in the Holy Land, or the head of the Catholic Church, like the Patriarch and his bishops. And it was amongst them both that they kind of went through the images and said, this is yes, this is no, this is possible, this is not possible, and eventually ended up with nine visuals that they could agree upon and allow us to use. And the one image that I personally eventually self-censored was the image where I used Rachel Curry as in that image, and I then decided I'm not gonna use it, as I said, out of respect for her family, but also maybe out of fear that this might completely, kind of blow in my face, as it was a bit controversial, and I didn't show it to you, of course.
Yeah.
So,
we need to wrap up, but I want to ask you all a question, because this is also the end of the conference, not only of the panel. I'd like to ask you what you fear. What you fear of art, what you fear for art, what your fears are related to art, its present, its future.
Well, I'd say the greatest fear I would have is something to follow up on what you mentioned, Lisa. We all assume that the political art comes from the left, which most of us are sympathetic to. But I fear strong art images coming from the right. And when you think of Albrecht Speer and his spectacles for the Nazis, it's pretty powerful art, whether you like to confront that or not. And so, yes, that's worrisome because it's a broad political spectrum.
It seems to me that if we speak about general public in the Western countries, it looks, it sees art more and more purely commercial, something that is sold and bought at international auctions. It is very much in the center of attention. And so I don't think, it's not like I fear it, but I have a feeling that art is a medium of formulating political, social issues as a public space for the message, so to say, is decreasing in its relevance, and art is more and more looks like a commercialized entertainment. That is sad, but it's not tragic, because we have beyond art many other possibilities to manifest and to formulate our positions.
I think just the opposite, actually. I mean, I think there is again, a lot is written about art's value, and there's too much focus on art as a commodity. And but on the other hand, there are really strong movements among artists for art as social change and different ways of working outside of the market all over the world. New York is a marketplace, so it is weighted that way here, but it's a global situation, and there are new generations and there are art centers elsewhere where other values are privileged. And
what is your fear?
So what's my fear is that I think my fear is that we don't, that we're not open enough to tolerance and understanding of difference. That's my biggest fear here. And when I think of the events of 9/11 and how little we've progressed in our understanding of those events, it's mind-boggling. That's my fear, my personal fear, and it touches art sometimes.
If I may say something to that, of course, yes, beyond art market, But this beyond art market is time and again seen as being something socially useful. Yeah, art wants to be useful, and as being useful, it's also neutralized. It's like a student of mine. She told me once, my favorite artist is Joseph Beuys. And so why? Because he brought so many trees to Kassel. It's not only one thing, yeah, but she valued him only for that. So for something nice, yeah. So the question, the commercial or nice?
No,
and of course, what I mean is not nice.
I'm thinking more in terms of social impact and art that goes out beyond the art world into other realms. And I see this everywhere, and I find that very encouraging. So, not
Jack.
so nice always.
Not always.
No.
Yeah, again, the place that I come from, the fear can be, fear of, for one's life, because if you're, you can, if you go too far, you can be easily excommunicated, labeled as whatever collaborator, and then traitor, and then I don't know what. And we've seen the case with few people like Giuliano Khamis. You can get killed. It's not easy to kind of play with these things. I know in places where I worked, for example, in the Emirates, you can end up in prison for many, many, many years for an artwork. And no one can do anything about it. You can, of course, in other countries, you can, of course, get a death sentence if you play with, these delicate issues. So in that part of the world, you're always checking how far I want to go. And as I said in kind of the paper, where one kind of needs to pick one's own battles. Otherwise, you can get into very serious trouble, very serious.
The ultimate fear. Thank you all so much. This was fantastic. And thank you.